Welcome back to The Heat. We're talking about the ongoing talks in Vienna that could result in a final deal on Iran's nuclear program. Joining me now is Hillary Mann Leverett. The former U.S. diplomat has over 25 years of experience in foreign policy and has served at U.S. embassies in the Middle East. Hillary, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
The nuclear talks have restarted in Vienna. What do you feel about prospects for a comprehensive deal?
Well, I think they probably are the best that they have been in at least a decade. But with that, I think there are some reasons to be cautious. The gaps between the parties are pretty wide, and I mean the parties being principally the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Other members of the P5 are not really as far apart with Iran as the United States is, but the United States is pretty far apart. At this point, the United States does not want Iran to have an industrial scale nuclear program, even a civilian one. And so it will be hard to bridge those gaps, even with the best of intentions.
Is that the main stumbling block there on what Iran gets to keep?
Well, it's the big strategic picture is, can the United States turn back on 35 years of policy that does not accept the Islamic Republic as a legitimate system, does not accept it as a state pursuing its interests as it sees them, like we did under the Shah. For 35 years, we have increasingly pursued a policy that rejects that right for Iran. By signing a nuclear deal, almost regardless of whatever it says, the United States would be renouncing that 35 years of policy and recognizing that Iran has sovereign rights, treaty rights, and can be treated like a normal state. That's the big picture issue. And then when you get down to some of the particulars, the question will be for the United States whether we can countenance a country that will be strong, independent, and a real nuclear power. Not a weapons power, but a real nuclear power.
Are there no indications right now that the U.S. Is willing to allow Iran to have some kind of civilian nuclear capability? I mean, we have Dr. Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor, who's in Israel right now trying to convince the Israelis that this is the way to go. We should let Iran have some nuclear capability.
Well, there has been a shift in U.S. policy under the Obama administration just in the past 2 years, where we've had this 35 years of policy rejecting the Islamic Republic as a legitimate system. But in the past 2 years, there's been some coming around in Washington to this kind of view that, well, we can accept Iran if and only if it can become part of a pro-American, U.S.-led security and political order in the Middle East. Now, to do so, the states in the region have to give up some elements of sovereign rights, to have a big functioning military, to have full industrialization, and to have policies that support the United States. So I think what the U.S. team is really trying to test is whether the Islamic Republic of Iran can join this pro-American political and security order. And by doing so, to signify that Iran could do this, they would limit their ability to have a civilian nuclear program according to American wishes. But
that sounds like what the United States is demanding here is a lot more than just a nuclear deal. It's looking for a partner there.
The nuclear deal is really almost like when Nixon and Kissinger first went to China and the relationship opened. We had the Shanghai Communique. At the end of the day, it was just a piece of paper. It means nothing in the broader scheme of what has become a huge relationship between the U.S. and China. The nuclear deal between the U.S. and Iran essentially would serve that function. It would be the equivalent of the Shanghai Communique to allow for this opening of a relationship between Iran and the United States. Now, the big difference is the United States wants that relationship on the terms that will favor a pro-American political and security order throughout the region, throughout the Middle East. What Iran wants in that relationship is to maintain its independence, maintain its sovereignty, and continue to have this ability to rise as an important power. Now, it may be possible for those two goals to be met, but it will be extremely difficult.
You know, we talked to Dr. Mohammad Marandi, who's a teacher at the University of Tehran. One of the points he made was that at this stage, especially when we look at these negotiations, there is a lack of goodwill, he said, on the part of the United States going into these talks. And one of the things he mentioned is that the United States continues to threaten Iran with a military attack. And in pointing to that, he said, well, look, the United States is always telling us that all options are on the table, which includes the military option.
And that certainly is historically correct. But I think one of the things that has made these negotiations possible in a constructive manner is that from August of this past year, August 2013, when President Obama declared that the United States would militarily attack Syria after chemical weapons were used there, and then had to walk it back and say, no, actually I can't do that. Congress isn't going to support me. No one around the world is going to support me. With that, the United States' ability to credibly threaten the effective use of force greatly diminished. So now you don't hear President Obama say nearly as much that all options are on the table, not because the United States may not want to have that, but because we don't have it right now. We lost it over Syria and with some of the other failed military interventions and occupations over the past decade in Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan. These cumulative failures have made the ability for Washington to threaten the credible use of force much less powerful.
When we look at these negotiations right now on the nuclear program, I mean, what would a final agreement look like?
A final agreement, in some ways, they're going to try to have it as specific as possible, to really hold each side to as much account, not to build trust, but essentially to build in triggers to punish the other side if something goes wrong. That is not going to be a durable agreement. The way that I see it, the most effective agreement that could come to fruition, whether it's July 20th, that's the self-imposed deadline, or after that, will be something more vague. It will be something more along the lines of the Shanghai Communique between the United States and China, which essentially will say that Iran will be recognized as a sovereign state. There may be some interim period for confidence building, but that will be temporary, and that after that interim period, Iran will be recognized, especially by the United States, but all of the P5+1, as a normal sovereign state exercising normal sovereign rights, including those for a civilian nuclear program. Yeah,
there is already talk right now, even at the start of these talks, that it could be extended for another 6 months.
Yes, but if they get bogged down into the details of exactly how many centrifuges Iran could run for exactly how much time, that's a recipe for failure.
Let's look at it from the Iranian point of view. I mean, what will the Iranians be looking for here? Initially, I would presume they would want all sanctions to be lifted.
Of course. I mean, that would be the reason to even deal with the United States.
And even there's a bit of a difference because, you know, the Iranians talk about revoking sanctions. The Americans talk about just suspending sanctions.
Exactly, because the United States, at the end of the day, does want this greater goal, which is to bring Iran into this pro-American political and security order in the region that allows the United States to punish states that don't go along with that, including by the reimposition or the increasing of sanctions on them. So that's a big strategic goal for the United States. For Iran, though, Iran has not had trade relations with the United States for 35 years. And I think their strategy is, if they can get all U.S. sanctions lifted, that's great. But the real goal is not this kind of idea that the United States is going to change overnight. But if the United States can at least get out of the way, stand to the side, not enforce those sanctions, waive those sanctions at least every 6 months, that would allow room for other states that Iran is very focused on in Europe, in Asia, especially with China and other countries, to allow them to trade and invest more freely and without the constant threat of punishment from the United States, to allow them to invest in Iran's economy. That's the real economic prize. It's not to open up U.S. investment or U.S. trade per se.
Right. You know, a question I asked Dr. Morandi when I spoke to him a few minutes ago was the kind of effect that sanctions have had on bringing the Iranian leadership to the negotiating table. What kind of pressure are the Iranians under right now?
Frankly, I'm one of the very few Americans who continues to go to Iran and to actually visit, to go to the university, to listen and talk to a range of people. I think the idea that sanctions have so crippled the Iranians, and especially the Iranian leadership, that they have come crawling to the table is really part of the rhetoric American policymakers put out there to justify a policy that we have put in place now for 35 years that has not brought down the Islamic Republic, has not overthrown its government, and has not weakened it. We've seen Iranian power rise and rise. And I think in some ways the Iranians are letting us have a bit of that narrative to justify how sanctions, in a way, let the United States come to the table. That in a sense we could say, well, we imposed these sanctions and now, you know, we did our job. We're now in a negotiation and now we can start to ease those sanctions. In a way, it's a bit the reverse of what the American rhetoric is here from Washington. It's not so much that it brought the Iranians to the table, it really brought the Americans to the table.
You know, there is one unseen partner in these negotiations. Some may say it's the big elephant in the room, and that is Israel. I mean, to what extent is the United States negotiating with that in view, with Israel's concerns in view that Iran does not have a nuclear program of any kind?
For the United States, there are several negotiations going on at the same time. There's one negotiation going on with the Iranians, which perhaps in the scheme of things may even be the simplest negotiation. Then there's a negotiation with some of what we would call our allies in Europe, in Israel, and in Saudi Arabia. For different reasons, each of those sets of allies don't really want there to be a normal U.S.-Iranian relationship. They don't want the rise of Iran. Not any one of those, including those in Israel, are worried about Iran acquiring nuclear weapons and using them to annihilate any country. Nobody is worried about that. Their senior security officials at all levels have said so publicly that that's not the real concern. The real concern is Iran's rise as a power, including its ability to be essentially a threshold nuclear state and to exercise its national security in its interests. This is something that threatens not just Israel, it threatens Saudi Arabia, and it threatens even some of our European powers who have seen especially their economic power, diminish considerably over the past decade.
What do we know of Iran's chief negotiator, Mohammad Javad Zarif, the foreign minister who's leading the talks in Vienna? Is he very different from his predecessors?
Well, I negotiated with him for nearly 2 years over Afghanistan. He was one of the Iranian participants. I think just in the broader scheme of things, not necessarily just to compare him to other Iranian negotiators or his predecessors, but to compare him to diplomats that I dealt with across the board around the world. He is one of the most sophisticated, warmest, nicest people to actually be in a room with. And I think this is one of the unseen and almost intangibles in the negotiation. It is now routine for Americans to be dealing with him. Even a year ago or 2 years ago, this was something that you could be fired over in the U.S. government. Today, all of our senior officials are in regular email contact with him, are in regular phone contact with him, spend hours and hours at meetings with him in Geneva and Vienna. I think he has a PhD here from the United States, from the University of Denver in international law. He understands how Americans think, the American use of the English language. He is someone that is very, very comfortable with American diplomats. His predecessors, I think, like Foreign Minister Zarif, were very firm defenders of the Islamic Republic, but didn't necessarily have the experience and the comfort level necessarily with the Americans that he does. That can have pluses and negatives. I think in terms of how Americans view him, that's a plus, but in terms of maybe his ability to sell an agreement with a broad range of people, not just in Iran, but around the world, not everybody thinks like Americans, so he may not have the same pluses he has with his ability with Americans to go over as well with everybody else.
Hilary Mann Leverett, thanks for your insights. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We are going to take another break right now, but coming up next, a former Iranian ambassador who's been at the heart of previous Iranian nuclear talks. Stay with us.